Through his personality, his progressive politics, and his international leadership, Theodore Roosevelt cast a long shadow in the age of progressive politics and is one of America's most influential presidents of all time. He could have won a second presidential nomination in his own right. However, he felt bound by the promise he made in 1904. Instead of running for re-election, Roosevelt sought a successor who would carry out his policies. He hand-selected William Henry Taft, Secretary of War and former governor of the Philippines, who was a mild, progressive leader. In 1908, TR steamrolled the Republican convention to get Taft's nomination on the first ballot. Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan again. The campaign of 1908 wasn't even close. Taft and Bryan both tried to claim progressive roots. However, the majority of Americans chose the Roosevelt-endorsed Taft, who polled 321 electoral votes to Bryan's 162. Third-party socialist Eugene Debs amassed nearly 500,000 votes in the popular vote. This political cartoon comes from 1908. It's called Baby, Kiss Papa Goodbye. Teddy Roosevelt leaves with his baby, his policies, in the hands of his chosen successor, William Howard Taft. Friction began between Taft and Roosevelt as the administration parted ways on politics, personality, and the direction of progressive America. While most Americans today think of William Howard Taft as the president who was so big he got stuck in a bathtub, he actually was a very capable lawyer and judge, and was a trusted administrator under Roosevelt. However, he did suffer from some lethal political handicaps. First of all, he didn't have the personality of TR. He was much more passive or mild in his reaction to challenges. Taft generally adopted an attitude of passivity towards Congress, and he was out of touch with public opinion. Sometimes his candor led him to have foot and mouth syndrome, or say one thing only to regret it later. Like when he called the Payne-Aldrich bill to raise tariffs the best little bill the Republican Party had ever passed, despite the fact that most progressives were opposed to raising tariffs and wanted them lowered. Furthermore, his cabinet did not contain one single representative of the insurgent wing of the Republican Party. All in all, he was a mild progressive, but his heart was wedded to the status quo rather than to major change like the boss before him. We've already discussed one example of this. Taft's foreign policy supplanted Roosevelt's big stickism with dollar diplomacy, encouraging Wall Street investors to invest in foreign areas of strategic American concern rather than using the military to force America's desires upon an unwilling nation. This was especially evident in the Far East, places like the Philippines and the Panama Canal. Although Roosevelt would be known as the trust buster, Taft actually gained some fame as a smasher of monopolies as well, and in reality brought more trust to heed than Roosevelt or any other progressive president. 90 suits were brought against trust during his 4 years as president, compared to the 44 under Roosevelt in 7.5 years. He was the president responsible for dissolving Standard Oil in 1911. Now, it's important to recognize this particular moment in history because of its impact on Supreme Court precedent. It's in the case against Standard Oil that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the doctrine of breaking up trusts will be established based on those that unreasonably restrain trade, not based on the size of the business. So in one respect, while Taft won the day by breaking up one of the most infamous trusts in American history, on the other hand, the Supreme Court is setting a more conservative tone to look at the impact of monopoly as opposed to its size only. Another important moment of trust busting in the Taft administration came in 1911 when he effectively broke up the U.S. Steel Corporation. This is important in two regards. First of all, we're very familiar with J.P. Morgan and uh, his investment in Carnegie Steel and the creation of U.S. Steel Corporation. We've already discussed how Roosevelt had supported the merger between U.S. Steel Corporation and a few mines that were um, in Western Kentucky. But the other reason that this is important is because this began a process of Roosevelt and Taft growing increasingly and publicly at odds with one another. The Payne-Aldrich Bill is another example of that. The former President Roosevelt had been campaigning loudly against the increase of tariffs, while President Taft claimed that this was the best bill the Republican Party had ever passed. The things came to a head between Taft and Roosevelt in 1911 when, out of frustration, Taft fired Gifford Pinchot, the chief of forestry and Roosevelt's close friend. While Taft was a dedicated conservationist, his accomplishments were overshadowed by a conflict between Pinchot and the senior Secretary of Interior, Richard Bollinger, who wanted to open up public lands in Wyoming, Montana, and Alaska to corporate use. Bollinger has sharply criticized Pinchot for protecting these reservations that could have been profiting in the private sphere. Ultimately, Taft sided with Bollinger, Pinchot was ousted, and the relationship between Taft and Roosevelt would never be the same. Well, Teddy Roosevelt had promised to leave office. He had never promised to stay out of politics. He continually was the banner carrier for the reform-minded Republicans, and they turned to him for advice and leadership. Roosevelt loved the public light, and Roosevelt kept giving speeches. Perhaps one of his most famous speeches came after he was president. In 1910, at Osawatomie, Kansas, Roosevelt announced a new doctrine that the Republican Party ought to adopt: the policy of new nationalism. This speech was given as part of a two-day dedication ceremony to a John Brown Memorial Park. This speech, later called the New Nationalism Address, evoked a wide variety of responses. It was labeled communistic, socialistic, and anarchistic in various quarters, especially amongst conservative Republicans, while others, progressives, hailed it as the greatest oration ever given on American soil. It urged the national government to increase its power to fix economic and social abuses. The results of Roosevelt's speech were a division within the Republican Party. The following year, Republicans lost badly in the congressional elections. Even a socialist was elected as the new mayor for the city of Milwaukee. In 1911, the National Progressive Republican League formed as a party faction behind the fiery Senator Bob La Follette. We've discussed throughout our year the consequences of friction and fracturing within political parties. The Republican Party was now in a full-fledged revolt. As of February 1912, Roosevelt wrote to 7 governors that he was willing to accept a Republican nomination. He rationalized that his return to a candidacy would not violate his previous promise, as he had only meant that he would not seek 3 consecutive elective terms. The former president took on the current president in the Republican Party primary of 1912. Roosevelt's supporters were 100 delegates short of winning the nomination. They had challenged the right to some of 250 of Taft's delegates to be seated at the conference. Most of these contests settled in favor of Taft. However, Roosevelt refused to quit the game. Having tasted for the first time the bitter cup of defeat, Teddy led a third-party crusade, and out of this conflict was born the Progressive Republican Party, better known as the Bull Moose Party. This came from a quote Roosevelt gave when he was asked how he was feeling, and he replied he was feeling as strong as a bull moose. While Roosevelt had always prided himself on his manliness, the Bull Moose Party also bore the endorsement of important suffragettes like Jane Addams for his support of female suffrage. Democrats put forward Governor Woodrow Wilson. He had been the president of Princeton University in 1902 and was a reformer and trust-busting governor of New Jersey in 1910. Taking on Roosevelt's New Nationalism platform, Wilson presented a progressive reform platform of his own he dubbed the New Freedom. Here's a side-by-side comparison of New Nationalism versus New Freedom. What we're seeing here is that Roosevelt and Wilson agreed on more active government, but disagreed on specific strategies to accomplish that. Roosevelt's broad program looked forward and towards comprehensive welfare, as well as a robust and active set of government regulation through public agencies. He promised to add more powerful regulatory agencies to monitor and police private enterprise. He campaigned vocally for women's suffrage. And surprisingly, he was the first presidential candidate to suggest a national minimum wage and a public health care system. Wilson, by contrast, promised a vibrant, freer market favoring small business and entrepreneurship. The government would continue to take a strong-handed approach to dangerous monopolies that threatened competition, but he attached to this a promise of less government regulation than Roosevelt had brought. He was against social welfare programs and championed banking reform and tariff reduction in traditional progressive style. The Republican split surely boosted Wilson to victory, as he failed to win a clear majority in any state outside the old Confederacy. The election gave the Democrats solid control of the White House and both houses of Congress for the first time since the Civil War. Wilson only won 41% of the total popular votes. Roosevelt finished second with 88 electoral votes, and Taft only won 8 electoral votes. Impressively, socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs rolled up with 900,000 plus votes in the popular vote, roughly 6% of the total population. Another famous political cartoon, The Finishing Touch of 1912. Despite the excitement generated by Roosevelt's Progressive Party and its challenge to the GOP in 1912, this election eve cartoon depicts Woodrow Wilson, attired in his academic garb, preparing to slay Roosevelt as he charges into the frame of the photograph. The latter had already been injured by a slew of controversies, including allegations of improper campaigning contributions during the previous election. Wilson's campaign manager and future Treasury Secretary, William McAdoo, holds the cape. As for President Taft, he actually lived to a quite old age. He was happy to see the White House days behind him. He lost weight, He taught law for a few years at Yale University, and in 1921 he became the first and only U.S. president to be nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court, a job which he enjoyed and was much better suited for than the presidency. Thomas Woodrow Wilson became the second Democratic president since 1861. He was the first president from one of the seceded Southern states since Zachary Taylor had been president 64 years earlier. Wilson admired the Confederacy's attempt at independence, and it inspired him to support the notion of self-determination. His ideal of faith in the masses, if they're properly informed, came from his educational background as well as his faith in Jeffersonian democracy. But to some, Wilson suffered from a serious defect of personality. Unlike Roosevelt, he was incapable of showmanship, and he was often viewed as cold or lacking a common touch. But Wilson was convinced that Congress could not function properly unless the president provided leadership. And he oftentimes turned to his eloquence as a way to go over legislators' heads and talk directly to the American people themselves. Before his election to President of the United States, Wilson served as president of Princeton University. He's the only American president to come from an academic background. He held moralist and ideas of reformer. In this Life magazine cover, he is depicted as a stern Roman consul. Wilson's academic background is represented by the scholarly owl at his side. Wilson's programs and his New Democracy called for an assault on the triple wall of privilege: the tariff, the banks, and trusts. Wilson first tackled the tariffs. He summoned Congress into a special session in early 1913. In an unprecedented move, he didn't just send a letter to Congress, he went there directly, making him the first president to give a State of the Union address directly to Congress as a way to appeal to them for political reform. The outcome of this move was the Underwood Tariff Act and future efforts by the president to talk directly to Congress and the people from what became known as the presidential bully pulpit. When the tariff bill was challenged in the Senate by lobbyists, Wilson again took to the public forum to issue a challenge to the American people to hold their elected representatives accountable. Another clearly modern move and use of the bully pulpit as the president went to the public through the media. Public opinion worked. In 1913, the Senate approved the bill that Wilson wanted and provided for substantial reduction in import fees. Wilson's next move came in the form of a landmark tax legislation. The new 16th Amendment had made it possible for the U.S. government to collect such a tax. The first income tax was a graduated income tax, meaning that the more money a person earned, the more they paid in taxes. This particular tax only taxed incomes of the top 5% of Americans, or roughly those making over $3,000 a year. The average wage earner's annual income was somewhere around $740 a year. By 1917, income tax revenue had surpassed that of the tariff. Banking reform was next. The nation's financial structure creaked along under Civil War nation banking acts. The most glaring deficit was the inelasticity of our currency. For decades, politicians had battled over a gold standard, a silver standard, and bimetallism. The 1907 panic was in part a consequence of America's inability to have a diverse currency. Since most banks were located in New York, it became hard to mobilize the bank's efforts to issue currency in other parts of the country where it was needed. In June of 1913, Wilson once again appeared personally before Congress and called for sweeping bank reforms. He endorsed a Democratic proposal for decentralizing the bank and placing it into government hands. No longer would the national bank be a private enterprise. Instead, the Federal Reserve would become a semi-independent government corporation whose board was appointed by the President of the United States. This would assure the American people some public accountability. In addition, the banks would be spread across 12 geographic regional districts. And each of those districts would be empowered to issue paper money backed by the federal government to address issues such as inflation and interest rates. While antitrust legislation had been the primary issue in the campaigns of 1912, as well as defining moments for both Roosevelt and Taft, Wilson made antitrust legislation his fourth pillar of his attack on privilege. In a third appearance before Congress, Wilson asked for the creation of a Federal Trade Commission, which was realized in the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. This commission could crush monopolies at the source by rooting out unfair trade practices, such as unlawfully limiting competition, false advertising, mislabeling, product tampering, and bribery. Wilson is also responsible for some of the first workers' compensation laws passed at the federal level. The La Follette-Siemens Act guaranteed decent treatment to those working for America's merchant marine ships, as well as a livable wage. The Workingmen's Compensation Act of 1916 granted assistance to federal civil service employees if they were disabled on the job. And the Adamson Act of 1916, which made it a federal law that the length of a workday is 8 hours, and it guaranteed anyone working over 8 hours would receive overtime pay. Causes championed by the populists included the Federal Farm Loan Act, which made credit available at preferred interest rates to farmers, the Warehouse Act of 1916, which allowed farmers to take loans against their staple crops from the federal government at low or no interest rates, the construction of highways that made it easier to transport goods from the Midwest to the more urban centers of America, as well as the creation of ag extension offices that would operate out of state universities to help in the development of agricultural science and education. Beyond legislation also took progressive action, nominating one of the most liberal Supreme Court justices in American history to the bench. This is Louis D. Brandeis. He's the first Jewish American to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. It's important to note, though, that Wilson had his shortcomings. He stopped well short of recognizing equal treatment for African Americans in civil service jobs, and was also slow to react to women's suffrage, punting the issue until women proved that they deserved it through their service to the country during World War I.